Welcome to Dr. Dan Science. Today we're going to do heart surgery. You know, we looked at the whole idea of the circulatory system. What a magnificent engineering design. We got this pump, that's the heart. 4-chambered blood pumping machine. That's incredible. Beats somewhere between, 100,000 times a day. If you live to be 70 years old, up to 3 billion times. That's a lot of heartbeats associated with that. We also, in addition to that, we're going to have the plumbing. That's going to be our arteries. That's going to be carrying blood away from the heart. We have the veins that carries blood to the heart. And we have the capillaries, which are kind of found in between. Those are going to be the site of exchange. Little tiny blood vessels that are going to be supplying the nutrients, the gases, taking some of the waste products away from the cells back into the bloodstream. All of this taking place, upwards of 90,000 miles of blood vessels found inside you. And of course, we got this special liquid that it's moving, known as blood. Now, let's take a look at this heart. This is a heart that comes from a pig. Now, I was not personally responsible for the slaughter of the pig. We do work with a group here where we can get these things just from the slaughterhouse, which is wonderful. And we're going to give you a chance just to take a look at a pig's heart up close and personal. Now, if you look at the size of it, first of all, it's about the size of a man's fist, right? And that's really about the size of your heart. Look at your fist. Think about it sitting in your chest. It's on the left-hand side, just slightly off the midline, and it's kind of forward. So the top of the heart's like this. The base of it, the apex, is actually pointing inward, and it just sits in there. It does lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay, really kind of fun. Now, when we look at it, the anatomy of it, let's look at some of the things we can identify. First of all, we'll see it's got some funny little flaps on the top. So I'm going to lift this thing up here, and we got these funny little flaps on the sides. These are called auricles, and they were originally named auricles because the anatomist who named it thought it looked like dog's ears. How do you like that? The outside of your ear, the external part that we see, that's called an auricle. Right? So there's your auricle. And we have a right side and a left side. When we look at our little heart here, the right side's over here, the left side's over here. Okay? So this would be the right auricle, that's the left auricle. So far, so good. Underneath this tissue, remember, this is cardiac muscle. It's an involuntary muscle. It's one you don't have to think about. This thing is beating on its own, whether you're awake or asleep, whether you think about it or you don't think about it. It's going to have 4 chambers inside. The top portion of it is going to be 2 chambers, and there's going to be 2 chambers down below, right? So we have the atrium on top. So this would be the right atrium in this area, right ventricle, right down there. And then we're going to have the left atrium over here, and our left ventricle right over there. If we take a look at our little model that I have over on this side, you can see the same kind of thing. We'll just kind of turn it on the inside. We look at this, and this is going to be our left atrium, our left ventricle. This is our right atrium and our right ventricle. And the way the heart actually works is the top chambers are going to contract together. So the atria contract, then the ventricles contract. Goes atrium, ventricles, atrium, ventricles, atrium, ventricles, right? So we have the contraction of this heart muscle actually is in 2 phases, okay? Now, here's our little heart. You'll notice that in between these chambers, we're going to have valves. We actually have 4 valves. You only see 2 of them that are in here, but we have a valve which is kind of like a door that only swings inward. It allows the blood to go from this chamber down to this chamber, from the atrium to the ventricle. A goes to V, and it's got to pass through this thing called a valve. This is a mitral valve over on this side, on the left side. On the right side, same kind of idea. We're going to be having the blood get squeezed out of this atrium, out of this chamber, and it's going to be pushed through this valve. It's called the tricuspid valve, and that's going to go into the right ventricle, right? So we see that there's a system where things are moving through only in one direction. The blood returns to the right side of the heart. This is the right side right here. So it goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Then it's going to go up and leave the heart and go to the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery then takes it to the pulmonary organ. Another name for pulmonary is lungs. We take this deoxygenated blood, they kind of show it as being blue, right? So this is going to be low oxygen content comes and returns to the right side. It's going to carry that blood up here, goes to the lungs. At the lung level, those capillaries are in there too. There's going to be a site of exchange, and now the oxygen is going to get back into the bloodstream. The carbon dioxide, we breathe out, right? So now the blood returns to the left side, goes into the left atrium, goes past the valve, goes to the left ventricle, and then it's going to go out this really, really, really big blood vessel known as the aorta. And the aorta then is going to then pass that along to the arteries as they get smaller and smaller and start distributing all around the body to the various cells where the oxygen and the nutrients are going to be passed to the cells. So here's kind of your setup. This is what our model looks like, but we want to take a look at the actual heart and see if we can identify some structures. Let's go back to our heart. If we look at our heart, you'll notice that this is, again, the right side, this is the left side, and you'll see it's kind of Valentine shaped. Now again, if you forget that the atria on top and the ventricles on the bottom, think of this kind of like V-shaped, and at the very bottom of the V is where the ventricles are. So you've got the left ventricle here, right ventricle there. A goes to V, A goes to V, right? Now in between here, this is going to be the left coronary artery and vein. One thing that's so intriguing about the heart itself is that it needs its own blood supply. You would think all this blood that's circulating through the heart, through the four chambers, through the four valves would be enough for it. It wouldn't need to have its own blood supply. But that's not the case. It turns out that the blood that supplies the cells of this cardiac tissue actually are carried through the coronary arteries and veins. There's a left one and there's a right one. And it turns out if these things get blocked, all of a sudden something happens where the blood doesn't flow normally and it blocks, then anything downstream from that is not going to be supplied with what it needs and the cells die. A common name for that situation is known as a heart attack or cardiac arrest. It could be a minor heart attack, which would mean just a small portion of the heart's involved, maybe not a part that's going to really cause a lot of malfunction and the person can still live through it, or you could have a major heart attack and that's going to be deadly. So these are the actual blood vessels that are needed to supply the heart. And this tissue, this muscle tissue, doesn't regenerate itself, doesn't repair itself. When it's been damaged, when it's been hurt, at best, it's going to have scar tissue. But it's not going to be as good as before that all happened. So we look at that and say, okay, that's kind of cool. If we take this thing and we tip it up, and I'll try to point it so you can kind of see, you'll see that there are blood vessels that are actually coming out of the top of this thing. Right? Various sized blood vessels. And this one right here, when I feel this thing, it is super duper thick, right? It almost feels like it's all elastic. You know what elastic is. You know, think of some kind of a garment that stretches. Well, this is the aorta. This is that really big blood vessel, and I'm right now putting this probe right into the left ventricle. Okay, the left ventricle, when it squeezes the blood and it pushes it out the aorta, it's coming through this big old garden hose right here. High pressure kind of a thing. That's going to then carry this oxygenated blood to the various cells in the body. We'll also find that there's a real flaccid, kind of wimpy looking vessel in comparison. Look at that wall there. Look at the wall here. Okay? Big difference in size. This is actually the pulmonary artery. When I put my little probe in here, this is going to be going to the right side of the heart, to the right ventricle. And so this one's going to be a low pressure side of the heart. Remember, our bloodstream, our blood vessels are actually under pressure. That's why you feel a pulse when you touch your arm, and you can feel the little bolus of blood almost, you could think of it as a bolus, moving through. Right? That's under pressure, like a garden hose would be. If you kind of close the end of the spigot and turn on the house water, all of a sudden that garden hose is going to get really, really rigid, really, really tight. A lot of pressure inside there. So we can look at some of these things and say, okay, I can kind of figure out which side I'm on just by looking at the blood vessels coming off the top of it. And remember, when this thing is sitting in your chest, right, and so this person is kind of looking at you, the person's head's right here, right? You got the chest there. The top of the heart is actually kind of facing this way, kind of a football player, and the bottom portion is pointing away. Now, what we want to do is we're going to take this heart and we're going to open it up and see what we find inside here. So we're going to take our scalpel and we're going to start over on the right-hand side. And so you can see this is a very muscular bit of tissue here. And we're just going to take this scalpel blade and see if we can kind of just start cutting through here. Hopefully we can cut through without it resisting us too much, without whacking too much of the tissue apart. And what I'm going to try to do here is just kind of cut right down into the chamber itself. All right, we've now opened up the heart. Now as we look inside here, we're going to notice that we've got two chambers going on here. Okay, so our lower chamber, so our upper chamber right here is going to be the right atrium and the right ventricles down in this region. And we're going to see that we have this wonderful little valve that's going to be in between. I'm going to give a little bit more of a cut so I can see this better. Yeah, I'm liking that better. All right, so now we got it where we want to. All right, we can see this is the top chamber. So here's the right atrium, here's the right ventricle, and in between here, you're going to find that we have these funny little tissue down here. These are the valves. Just like that, we'll get our little probe here. This is the valves right here. See it there? See it there? And these valves, what they're going to do, there's three cusps on this side. The valves right here are going to close. When this portion squeezes the blood in, that's the right atrium, it's going to force it down into this region, which is the right ventricle. But as it does that, these little valves right here are going to close the door so none of the blood, when this squeezes, goes backwards. Now, when we think of the heart actually makes sounds. You know, a veterinarian, a physician, someone in the healthcare profession listens to the heart sounds and makes sure it sounds healthy. The sounds of a normal heartbeat would be lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And that's actually the sound of the valves closing. Lub-dub, lub-dub. If something happens where all of a sudden, where the ventricles, when they squeeze back, some of the blood goes retrograde or in reverse, all of a sudden there's a new noise in there. It's called shh, kind of a sound, right? So we have a new heart sound that goes like this. Lub sh dub, lub sh dub, lub sh dub, right? Sounds like I'm a musician or something. That's what a heart murmur sounds like. Sometimes they're innocent, which means they'll go away. That's not really affecting the person a whole lot. Other times it's a sign of disease. Something's going on that shouldn't be there, all right? So here we've got these valves. Now, I want you to notice something else which is interesting. You'll see that there's these little strings that seem to be connected to the valves themselves. And you know, you can kind of make the analogy, if you've ever gone camping, that you know, you put a tent up and you put these little stays on the tent, so if any wind comes by, the whole tent doesn't go flying, right? It kind of keeps things in position. Well, we can kind of think of these little heart strings, if you will, for that purpose. This is going to keep this door opening just inward and not opening backwards, okay? Think of like the old westerns where somebody walks into the saloon and you know the door swings forward, backward, so on. These doors just swing forward, and then when they swing back, they come right into place. So that's what these things are for. They're called the chordae tendineae. We don't talk about that specifically in the class, but that's the name of them. But the common name is heartstrings. You know, so I remember growing up, I heard about, you know, a situation where somebody broke up with somebody else. You know, the scenario. Boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, girl breaks up with boy, boy's heart is broken, right? And the boy says, you know what, that girl sure pulled on my heartstrings. Well, now you got to see what the heartstrings are. One thing that's also interesting about it is these heartstrings are connected to these things called papillary muscles. And what's so intriguing about this, remember, we want the blood only to go in one direction. We want to go from the right atrium to the right ventricle, from the left atrium to the left ventricle, right? You got the lung in between there. When this thing actually pushes the blood in here and these little doors close up, these muscles have to contract at just the right amount to keep the tension just right. So again, the door seals at the very moment that the ventricles contract. All these things are happening split second. They say your heart is beating like every 0.9 seconds, right? Incredible. And this is all happening unconsciously. The other thing I'll mention real quick about the right side before we go to the left is that there's a pacemaker that's actually built into the right side of the heart. Now, I've never been able to discover it by looking at it, and I don't believe you can, But there's a little pacemaker that's right up here in the right atrial area. This little pacemaker actually sends electrical signals to the atria so that the atria contract in unison at the same time. There's going to be another signal that actually passes down across here into the ventricular region, and that's going to fire off another little signal, and that's going to send the ventricles into contraction. So you have this thing called an SA node. That is the pacemaker of the heart, and it's found in the upper portion of the right atrium. Incredible, right? You look at this and say, yep, looks like a bunch of tissue to me. But man, the technology built in here is just extreme, absolutely extreme. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to take a look at the other side. That was the right side of the heart. Remember, that's the return side. That's the venous side. That's the side that picks up the oxygen-poor blood. Well, once we go ahead and we pump the blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle to the lungs, so now that we can blow out the carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen, it's now going to return to the left side. So we're going to take our scalpel, and in the same fashion, we're going to try to cut this thing so that we can take a look inside. Oh my goodness, oh, isn't that beautiful? All right, we've got this little rascal open. As we look now on this side, we're looking at the left atrium on top. There's our valves right there. And then we have our left ventricle down below. Now you can certainly see the valve really nicely here. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? Okay, there's a little chordae tendineae. They're going to be attached to these papillary muscles that will contract at the very moment that the valves are going to seal. And we see just the same situation. So this looks like, again, the same as the right side, but there's going to be one difference that's very significant. Okay, you can really see it now. The one thing that's really significant is take a look at the walls. The thickness of the walls are different on the left side of the heart versus the right side. I mean, look at that. That's a nice little steak there, right? We're talking about really thick meat. If we come over to this side, notice what the thickness looks there. Okay, the thickness is much less. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Why? How come the right side has a very thin muscle in comparison to what we see with the left side, which is very, very thick? Well, the easy way to think about it is, what are the two different sides pumping to? If we think of the right side, remember, it's going to be pushing the blood up the pulmonary artery. The artery is taking it to the lungs, so that's the pulmonary part. Artery means it's carrying it away from the heart. That blood vessel is actually one of those exceptions to the rule. Typically, we think of arteries being oxygen rich. They're carrying blood away from the heart. But notice this is coming from the right side of the heart, which is oxygen poor. It hasn't had time yet to go to the lungs. Once the pulmonary artery gets into the lungs and the capillaries and the gas exchange takes place, then the pulmonary vein is going to be the blood vessel that carries the blood over to the left atrium. In the left atrium, now everything here is going to be oxygen rich, right? And then as it goes from the left atrium, it's going to go to the left ventricle, out the aorta to the rest of the body. The right side of the heart only has to pump as far as the lungs are. Keep in mind, the lungs are sitting right here. They're sitting right around it. This heart is sitting right in between the lungs. It doesn't have to pump very far. Hence, the actual walls are relatively thin. On the other hand, when we're looking at the left side, now we're looking at a very, very highly muscled wall, both for the atria and the ventricle, and that's going to be for the reason that now it's got to pump it all the way to your toes, all the way to your fingers, all over your body, and that's going to take a tougher pump. Remember, we got 4 chambers. We've got 4 different valves also. I just showed you 2 of them. Here we see just a masterpiece of design. You know, the joke is, of course, these things are really well made. They're guaranteed for life. So, you know, you look at this and say, that is just astounding. You look at that, each part of this is super duper important. This is all valve. You can see it all really nicely on this side here. So as we're looking at this thing, you know, we come back to these vessels on top. This one, which we said was the aorta, it's really, really thick. Let's see by taking our probe, where does it come down? There it is right there. The left ventricle pumps the blood and it's going to shoot it up this outlet. There's going to be a valve right in here. That's the other valve, the third valve we haven't talked about. It's a semilunar valve. We don't worry about that in this course, but that's where the third one is. And so that's your aorta there. If we come over to the other side, and we'll see if we can find our other part. It gets really, really messy when you start getting this thing all cut up. Okay. This one now comes over on the right side. Okay, this is your pulmonary trunk. Actually, it's a portion of that pulmonary artery, and you can see that's where the outflow is from the right side of the heart. So here is this beautiful, beautiful masterpiece of a pump, and it's sitting right in your chest, and it is just a wonderful picture of just the efficiency and the beauty of an incredible design of the heart itself. Thanks again for watching DrDanScience.com, and we'll see you again soon.